Well, with great pleasure, I'd like to introduce my friend Paul. Paul is done so much in the world of mushrooms, and he's so knowledgeable, and both from the folk side and from all kinds of different sides, he brings such a different, interesting perspective to mushrooms. And this one, actually, I think I've been really looking forward to listening to it ever since he told me he had it. So, with that, Paul from the Vancouver Mycological Society, president for a few years, on and off. They get you, drag you back in, and you're out, but they drag you back in. And working with the UBC Herbarium. And
he's got a book out.
Yeah, and he's got a book out. Exactly, that's right.
The Outer Spores, Mushrooms of Hiding Wine.
Yeah, we've got it here, and good book, and very good of the author to sign it. As I mentioned, we got another author over here with some of his books, Robert, and so. Excellent. Paul,
Thank you very much. Okay. Well, this is about the dark side of mushrooming, poisonings. And we've heard of Santa's elves that live in the north and labor all year long to produce gifts for good children. And it's somewhat ironic, the German word for poison is gift, as in gift pilze are poisonous mushrooms. So that got me thinking about Darwin's elves, who are out there all over the place, just waiting to select naturally those that shall continue to mushroom. And I wanted, with that idea, I went searching for a mushroom elf, and I found a delightful one. And to my great shock, the first time I put this on as a slideshow, I discovered it was animated. Gave me a bit of a start when I first saw it. I had no idea it was a little. No. Well, and I'd like to thank these people credited with photos here. Want to thank them. And also, I stole lots of stuff from the internet when necessary, but only when necessary. And I give the internet a great review. It's a great place to steal photos, because for legal use, you can use photos if it's for review purposes. So that's my review. Anyway, I'll now proceed with this. Okay, now, one of the classic questions that mushroomers get is, how can you tell an edible mushroom from a poisonous mushroom? And there's no real simple rule other than if you feed it to a lawyer and you get a lawsuit, it just might be poisonous. Right? So, there's various other versions of that. But, so there's all these folk myths. So poisonous mushrooms don't turn silver black. And in fact, you can boil up the deadliest mushrooms with silver and they won't turn it black. Poisonous mushrooms don't turn rice, onions, garlic, etc. a particular color. In fact, some mushrooms are great for coloring dishes. Or there's this saying that if you can peel it, it's edible. Well, I've tried peeling some deadly mushrooms and it works just great. Poisonous mushrooms are all different. There's no particular odor, texture, taste, etc. that indicates that mushrooms are safe or poisonous. It's a whole bunch of things. There's many habitats they grow in. Some folk myths say if it grows in a meadow, it's edible. If it's on wood, it's not, and vice versa. There's all sorts of examples of different poisonous mushrooms in different habitats. And of course, there's this saying, if a lot of people believe that if a mushroom has been eaten by an animal, it is edible. A lot of animals can eat things that we can't eat. And as you'll see soon, a lot of mushroom poisons take a long time to take effect. So you should be willing to follow a squirrel or a deer around for a number of days to make sure that they're okay. And poisons do take out animals. Now there's general safety concerns about eating mushrooms. A lot of the so-called mushroom poisonings are actually from other causes other than poisons that are contained in the mushroom, naturally. And so there's spoilage. Sometimes people get a bit goofy with wild mushrooms and they'll treat them in far poorer ways than any other type of edibles. They'll eat mushrooms in far worse shape than they would vegetables or meat or fish. You should be wary of where you collect them. Make sure it's pristine habitat. There are lots of sources for illness and morbidity from contamination, either chemical or bacteriological, biological. So there's agricultural chemicals, petroleum products, heavy metals, all these things should be of concern. And so if it's in urban areas, agricultural, industrial areas, and unfortunately quite often dog dew and such can be along in parks and public walkways and paths, so you always should be aware of whether the stuff is contaminated biologically. You should always cook mushrooms thoroughly, and there are certain mushroom species that are supposed to be much better, lightly cooked or not cooked, but as a rule, it's always good to cook them thoroughly, and this can be because we can't digest mushrooms very well. We don't have chitinase naturally to break down chitin, structural component of fungi. And so you don't derive nutrition or taste or a lot of things from mushrooms if they're not thoroughly cooked. And it also helps to decontaminate them should they have biological contamination. And many mushrooms are edible when they're well cooked, but not if they're raw. There's a lot of compounds that are unstable, that are deleterious to our health and well-being. But if you cook the mushrooms, it's driven off and are broken down. And a classic example is true morels. They're poisonous when they're raw, but they're fine when they're cooked for most people. Eat mushrooms in moderation. A lot of problems people get into is from pigging out on mushrooms. And there's things, I guess we could coin the term mycobezor, where you get obstruction. If you wolf down frying pans full of some kind of edible mushroom, you can end up with a blockage of the gut, so to speak. Or something that's very important is many mushrooms contain antibiotic compounds. And in small amounts, this might not affect you, but if you pig out a lot on mushrooms, you may well disrupt the natural gut flora in your body. So you'll get the runs and a bit of cramping, and that's from the disruption of the gut flora. So I recommend if you eat a lot of certain types of mushrooms and you find yourself getting all loosened up and such, you may want to scarf down something cultured, a probiotic thing, or yogurt, or something like that, to try to get the gut flora sort of back into some kind of activity. And also, there's just plain allergies, and a lot of people believe that allergies are something that just exists in you, but you develop allergies through repeated exposure to things, and even after a long time of taking in something, your body can suddenly produce an immune response to it. And so for this reason, if you are eating certain mushrooms and one mushroom all of a sudden gets you one day, and it might be bacterial contamination, might be something else, but if you try it again and that happens once again, you may well have developed a sensitivity to that mushroom. That happened to me with boletes. Yeah.
For you.
Yeah. And I'll discuss that a bit more future in this presentation. And that's, there's also been people that have developed severe allergies to morels after enjoying them for years. And there's other examples, anecdotally, that are quite often. Now, there are many different types of mushroom poisonings. All sorts of different chemical compounds are produced by large fungi that we attempt to eat. And it has a great spectrum, a great range of complexity of molecular structure and different effects, different organs that it'll affect, or different overall impact of eating these things. There are several really major types, well-known types, which are the classic groups of mushroom poisoning. In many presentations, like the mushroom poisoning posters that Edmonton Club produced, use these categories. So I will deal with that, ranging from some of the most alarming some mild ones. There's a general rule in naturally occurring biotoxins, toxins from plants, animals, fungi, that the longer the latency period, the longer it takes for the symptoms to emerge, the more serious the type of poisoning. And this is generally because a lot of naturally occurring toxins, they're very serious target particular organ systems. It takes them a while to get chugging away and doing their insidious work through various mechanisms. So quite often, if you get really short uptake of your symptoms, like your classic example is nausea, vomiting after eating mushrooms within an hour. Generally, that's just going to be a simply resolved gastrointestinal issue. If it is 12 hours or longer and you begin to get really sick, that is an alarm signal, and attention should be sought, particularly and rigorously if it's late onset. So severe. But of course, with the slow-acting toxins, you've already absorbed them. They're distributed through the body, circulatory system, whatever, the various tissues. And they're undertaking their damage, and treatment is very difficult. Elimination of the toxin from you at that point is very difficult. And severe damage occurs to organs such as liver, kidneys, and death may be likely in many cases. Here we have short uptake of symptoms, generally fairly positive. And we have just a classic gastrointestinal upset that resolves itself within a few hours. It would generally, a lot of this involves vomiting and diarrhea, and the body essentially purges itself of the offensive material. And then if you've lost a lot of fluid and electrolytes, you just want to replace that and rest, because you probably had a workout, a bit of a GI workout, as we call it. So when poisonings occur, when it's looked at how to proceed, generally it's all based on the symptoms the patient is experiencing. And hospitals and clinics and doctors, vets, etc., like to know what the offending mushroom is. They want to get it identified, but they are working at dealing with the actual symptoms as they're appearing and doing supportive and symptomatic treatment. And I am the point person for BC for mushroom poisonings. And so quite often material is sent to me for identification of poisoning. And I'll give a couple of case examples here eventually. So the complexity of chemicals involved varies greatly, and there's the really serious, classic, really scary cyclopeptide poisoning, the deadly Amanita poisoning, is caused by enormously complicated molecular structures that form these, they're called polycyclic peptides, and they form these big rings of nucleic acids and configurations. And then they can bond together these rings into larger aggregates around sugar molecules. And this whole big, messy, complex thing is in the mushroom, and you eat it, and the thing disaggregates and circulates around, and then eventually glues itself back together around sugar molecules in your gut or in your liver or wherever. And then this thing starts attacking that. There's a long uptake before the first symptoms occur with these very complex molecules. And there's some really just dead simple things like these monomethyl hydrazines, or really simple molecules that are remarkably simple for something that causes harm. Then we should remember cyanide is an extremely simple molecule, which are well-known toxin. So we have these different mushroom groups. So there's the very complex deadly cyclopeptides that are found in the deadly amanitas, like phalloides and verosa, the destroying angel and death cat. And they're found in certain canosybe, little tiny brown canosibes with rings on the stems. Gallerinas, like Gallerina autumnalis. Lepiotis species, a lot of little small Lepiotis contain the deadly cyclopeptides. Orelanin is a different form of toxin. So the deadly cyclopeptides attack the liver primarily and actually cause an exodus of elements out of the liver cells. And you can see in photomicrographs of liver tissue that each cell is grossly damaged, crumpled up and collapsed. And this long duration of uptake, up to 72 hours before the first symptoms. Then you go through a crisis period and it resolves. So Orelanin is an even longer 36 hours to 21 days before the first symptoms. I'd ask you all to reflect on what you had to eat exactly 3 weeks ago. And you might understand that it took a long time before it was realized that there's a group of mushrooms that cause kidney destruction, absolute kidney destruction, irreversible, with this huge delay period. Gyromychin, we just got a Gyromychin infuli in today, and great example of a poisonous mushroom. And that's something that is interesting because it is a volatile compound that can be driven off in the cooking process. Coprine is in Inky caps and in combination with alcohol that cause illness. There's some muscarine, causes sweating. I call it, it causes perspiration, salivation, lacrimation, so I call it drool, sweat, and tears. It's in quite a few species of Phytosomy, just a lot of Inocepi species, some mycenas. Ibotenic acid, muscimol, is psychoactives or deliriant or euphoriant compounds that are in Amanita mysterium, Amanita pantherina, and a few other amanitas. Psilocybin, psilocin are the classic magic mushroom compounds, true hallucinogens. Gastrointestinal irritants, or it's a whole range of things. So it's a lumping, melting pot of things that cause this usually rapid onset, gastrointestinal diarrhea, cramping, nausea, vomiting, weakness, abdominal cramps, and usually resolves through a whole bunch of different mushrooms. This is the most commonly encountered group of actual mushroom poisons. They're caused by actual toxins in mushrooms. And there's a few ones that are, just a few more. Amanita smithiana sometimes is mistaken for pine mushroom, and it causes kidney failure that is temporary, and usually recovery is fairly complete. Quite often a patient will just spend some time on dialysis and then everything restores itself and they go along and do great, but tend not to eat a lot of would-be pine mushrooms. That's very unpleasant, but not fatal yet for anybody. Bacillus involutus is insidious. Repeated ingestion of certain Bacillus, what we assume are involutus, but there may be several species involved, will cause an autoimmune reaction, causing acute anemia from your white blood cells attacking the red blood cells. And so you go into a period of acute anemia, and this usually occurs after a few exposures. And it's the only type of mushroom poisoning to have killed a professional mycologist. Perhaps not that good a professional. I was actually considered a very good professional mycologist, but like many professional mycologists, he didn't know how to identify edible mushrooms. He just knew the Latin names for them. And then there's some things that are edible, but can kill you and make you sick. They're what I call the poisonous edibles. Letiferous sulfureous, if they're old, they're undercooked, growing on certain trees. They can cause gastrointestinal symptoms. Morels poisonous when they're raw. Much to somebody's chagrin, there was a banquet held for Vancouver's police chief went to a retirement banquet, and the hotel that held the banquet poisoned a lot of the people at the banquet by serving raw morels, including the provincial health officer. Pleurisabora origins is a bit alarming. There were older Japanese men who had history of who had kidney disease and were on dialysis, and several of them got extremely sick, and some died from a type of brain encephalopathy, damage to the brain. The angel wings. Yeah. And then Trachloma equestre, infamous incident in France. In a bumper year, there were several deaths reported in France from people that ate many meals a day for several days in a row of the man on horseback, Trachloma flavivirus. So this is just a range of the types of mushroom poisoning. I'm just going to quickly go through the different groups. And so the most deadly, most lethal, the one that causes the most deaths are the cyclopeptides, especially the death cap mushroom, Amanita phalloides. Here we have the cyclopeptide compound, the Amanita. And Amanita phalloides popped up in California back in the 30s, I think it was 40s, presumed imported, or even 20s, imported with trees from Europe. And it's been on the spread since, and it popped up in Vancouver in 1997, I think it was. And we found it for the first time in the Fraser Valley under sweet chestnut trees in the Fraser Valley. And then shortly afterwards, it was found somewhat nearby under hazelnut, European hazelnut. And it's since been found in Vancouver, in sites all around where I live in Vancouver. And there's several types of trees, including all street imported alien street trees or garden trees. Victoria, there's been a lot of it showing up in the southern Vancouver Island area, always under imported trees. We've had several poisonings in BC already from it. We had one fatality, but turned out the person had been visiting in California, ate the mushrooms in California, traveled back to Vancouver, became sick and died in Vancouver from California mushroom poisoning. So beware, if you travel to California, don't eat California. And then get back to Canada really quick, because the health care is a lot. If you like your relatives, if you like your surviving relatives, you probably want them to have you die in Canada. Anyway, these are expected to be on the spread, and there's something which is quite alarming, which I discovered talking to the city arborist in Vancouver. I found out that all the trees that they've been growing under were bought by the city a few decades ago from particular huge nurseries in the Fraser Valley. And they used to supply most of Western Canada and parts of the Pacific Northwest U.S. with stock for growing for urban street trees. And then California got the sudden oak death, and there is a quarantine on trees and shrubs from Northern California, which prior to sudden oak death was the North American biggest supplier of urban planting material, and now much of that slack has been taken up by the nurseries in the Fraser Valley where the Amanita phalloides grow. So the very end where the city bought their, the same nurseries are exporting, apparently all across the U.S. now and across Canada. So I'm sure that Edmonton, Calgary, and other Alberta cities are also planting certain trees, especially certain trees that can support Amanita phalloides. So you should learn to identify it and keep an eye out for it. And it's great to be able to document this, and I make an effort. Got the word out to all the BC mushroom club people and mycology people to keep documenting this. Always preserve specimens when they find it, record the tree species, and someday I hope to do a bunch of research, dig into the city's archives to find out if their actual lot numbers extend for the particular nursery shipments. And then other things, Galerina autumnalis or marginata. And I just noticed a couple on the table. So we have one nice cyclopeptide containing mushroom here, and then there's some Lepiotis area on the table. So that's another juicy one if if anybody here is sick of their liver, give it a whirl.
Paul?
Yeah.
What's the size of those there? Because I'm just looking at
Oh, they're tiny. They're little brown mushrooms.
Yeah.
But they can grow with honeycombs.
Yes, yeah. And they also can grow mixed in with magic mushrooms. And so it's, when you're dealing with any sort of little brown mushroom, you're dealing with a pretty dangerous bunch. And the honey mushrooms, and there's also some people eat the Cuneroomyces mutabilis, which it's a little brown mushroom that grows in clusters on wood. So there's always potential for. So here's the Canosobe with the little ring. It's rather startling because the genus Canosobe also contains hallucinogenic species. So here we've got deadly and psychoactive occurring in the same genus. And then Lepiotis of Incarnata is a classic little tiny Lepiota that grows quite often in urban areas and in woodland, just out of twiggy duff and little, tree crap. And this is notable because we had a fatality in Vancouver. A man ate an omelet prepared from what he thought were fairy ring mushrooms from his backyard. And for years he'd been eating these little mushrooms that grew in rings in his backyard. And one time he ate a bunch and got classic cyclopeptide poisoning, died after a couple of weeks. And it turned out that he had all sorts of these Lepiotis of Incarnata growing in his backyard. There's several of these little tiny Lepiotas that are dead.
Well, we had a case a couple of years ago in Chicago. A person was ate these from under her spruce tree in the front yard.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not just a back.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Oh, and that's something which I'd like to point out. There's really dumb, bizarre things. If you start consulting on poisonings, you run into some really odd things. And I have also a certain point person for people to call or send emails to with just general inquiries, can I eat this? For some reason, people always are contacting me, asking me if they can eat these things that are growing in their yard. And I said, well, why do you want to eat them? Well, because they're growing in my yard. Well, do you have a cat in your yard? Or do you have rose bushes in your yard? Do you want to eat those? For some reason, people, when they find mushrooms growing in their yard, the first thing, oh, I wonder if I can eat these.
Well, it's because it's free food.
I guess so.
So this person survived with a liver transplant.
Oh, yeah.
And the doctor asked her, and it turns out the person had been eating any mushrooms that she found in the yard.
Oh.
Jesus.
Wow. You see, Darwin would have commented too. And did they offer her treatment?
But she had a liver transplant.
Oh, that's okay. Well, that's generous.
So she survived. It's currently a rare operation these days.
What they do now is piggyback liver transplants, and they just transplant a lobe. They take a lobe from a donor, quite often a living donor, and not necessarily cadaveric, but and then they'll just tie it into the patient's abdomen. They wide tube it into his bile and the whole hepatic drainage system, and then they're quite often, sometimes they leave the diseased liver in, or they remove portions of it, or the whole thing. And then eventually this lobe of liver will begin to regenerate and produce more and more liver tissue, and eventually becomes self-supporting. I don't even know if they have to continue immune suppression after certain points. But anyway.
Is she still eating mushrooms from her yard?
I haven't heard anything to follow up. Hope not. But I also handle poison center calls, like a lot of us across the country. And the adults are the ones that get in trouble.
Yeah,
because they purposely eat mushrooms they don't know what they are.
yeah.
Or like in another case, they ate morels raw. As the kids are out, you know, putting things in their mouth, and usually they don't ingest anything.
And it's just a random process,
Yeah,
and the
random.
chances of encountering a deadly thing by random isn't that much. Well, that's something. There are tens of thousands of species of mushrooms. There's a handful of really good, worthwhile edibles, and there's a relative handful of really dangerous mushrooms. So, unfortunately, a lot of the really dangerous ones are quite attractive looking to us. Okay, and then this very scary renal toxic orelanin exists in this group of Cortinarius called Lepiotis, which, and we don't know how widespread this is. This is one with a latency period of up to 3 weeks. And we know about the poisonousness of this mushroom thanks to the military training in a couple of countries. In Britain and in Poland, there were cases of army survival exercises. And in a Scottish case, a whole bunch of soldiers from all over the British Isles went to this one area and they did these survival training routines. And one of the things they did was gather edible mushrooms and make a big stew of it, and they ate it, and then they went off to their separate bases around Great Britain, began to drop from kidney failure a long time after the exercise. But eventually they were able to track down all of these cases to the common experience of this survival training, and they went through all the possible exposures, because there's lots of chemical compounds, man-made chemical compounds that can cause these types of kidney failures. And the common thing was this mushroom meal that they all ate. An eerily similar thing happened in Poland, and simply because of these masses of people that ate the same meal, that we know that these things are poisonous. It could have got to this. If it hadn't been for those two incidents, we might not have known that this happens. Gyromychin contain the gyromycin, a volatile monomethyl hydrazine, and various other hydrazines. And hydrazines are very scary. They're apparently used in research to induce tumor growth in rats. And there is an incident where there have been, over the years, scattered very puzzling accounts of poisonings, fairly distinct symptomology and clinical signs. And there had been an incident in the U.S. and California, and a physician had consulted on this, and he casually mentioned the case to an associate of his who worked in environmental health. And this associate had dealt with mass poisoning on a workplace, Los Alamos Jet Propulsion Labs, Pasadena. And several of the employees working on a new group of compounds had come out with a very serious, very distinctive and serious form of organ destruction, illness, and they'd been tracked down to what they thought was a synthesized compound called monomethyl hydrazine. And so the two physicians compared, they asked around. They soon got reports of other incidents of mushroom poisoning that appeared to resemble this monomethyl hydrazine poisoning. So they went ahead and they managed to obtain a bunch of the gyromycins and analyzed them, and found that they do indeed contain monomethyl hydrazine and other hydrazines, rocket fuels. And there have been cases where a chef prepared a meal, or people worked in a canning factory, canning gyromycins, and the chef or the cook or the people working in the canning plant got really sick with the classic gyromycin symptoms, monomethyl hydrazine. But the people that ate the cooked material didn't get sick. And it's because the volatile fumes were driven off during the cooking and were inhaled by the workers. And it's not recommended that any of these Gyromycins, halvellas, a lot of the cup fungi now are highly suspect. And so it's not recommended. In some country, Finland is infamous. The Finns are nuts, and they still eat lots and lots of Gyromycin esculenta. But otherwise, most other countries have banned them for consumption. I have a Finnish mushroom book that has symbols for edibility, and the Gyromychin esculenta has 3 daggers, 3 stars, and 3 question marks. And Caprinus atramentarius and some other ink caps contain compounds of coprine, and it's chemically quite similar to antabuse or disulfiram. And antabuse is something that blocks the body's production of certain enzymes involved in the breakdown of alcohol. So when you drink alcohol, it goes through a succession of breakdowns and eventually becomes glucose. But if you break that chain of enzymes working on the alcohol molecule, it can be left in aldehydes or other different toxic compounds that are in that chain. Usually the body immediately breaks it down as soon as these things are formed, but they accumulate if you've eaten the inky cap mushrooms and drank alcohol. So the alcohol is stopped halfway through the breakdown process. So you get toxicity from that.
Is that the only inky cap that does that?
No, it's being suspected a couple of other types of mushrooms that aren't caprinus might do that. And now it looks like the taxonomy of the inky caps is very complicated now. Looks like there's several species that we used to call atramentarius. And so I think if we were to systematically meet and have a wine and caprinus party, we could probably sort out how many of these species. We could have groups of people eating different species of caprinus and swilling wine and find out. I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't several mushrooms where this occurs. Oh, and then there's muscarine, drool, sweat, and tears as glycoside. Muscarine was first found in Amanita muscaria. But it turns out it wasn't the primary toxin in Amanita muscaria, but it bears the name muscarine from muscaria. But it was found in much higher concentrations in different other mushrooms, including Phytosopy and Inosopy. And so you should learn to identify and avoid these genera that have muscarine.
That's another one that used to be listed as edible.
Lots of different Inosopy species contain muscarine. And now, here's a case study. I was contacted after May 23rd, 2011. 2-year-old Chihuahua died and was seen eating mushrooms, and the owners collected some and submitted them for identification. And I was able to identify them as being Inoxabe mixtilis. This is a known muscarine-containing Inoxabe species. And in a case like this, I photographed the mushrooms. And one of the characters of mixtilis is it has a little bulbous base with a little rim around it. And as usual, when you have people that aren't into mycology, they just grab them out of the lawn. But I was very fortunate that a little bit of the base there showed this little rim that's characteristic of the Inosabes that have a bulbous base. And then a microscopic examination showed very characteristic crystal cap thick-walled cystidia, which many Inosabes have, and the shape and characters of this particular one combined with the spores, which are very nodulose. They look like little piggy banks or something, all the big knobs sticking out of them. And so that was able to get me to the Inoxabe mixtilis type of thing. So that's an example of what happens in an investigation. So the magic mushrooms, there are 3 types generally. Ibotenic acid, muscimol, or a particular group of compounds, type of compounds that are delirium. They're not a true hallucinogen, and you don't have a fully conscious sort of swirly, image-filled thing, but it's more going into a twilight sleep and having weird dreams. It's very euphoriant or delirium. Ibotenic acid occurs in the fresh mushroom, and it's not very active at all. In fact, you can eat a bushel of Amanita muscaria in some areas and you won't feel anything but bloating. But if they're dried out or cooked or altered in certain ways, the ibotenic acid breaks down into muscimol with the loss of water, and dehydroxylation results in a muscimol, which is psychoactive, and then that causes a sort of delirium state. And it's a beautiful, so wonderful class of mushroom, different color varieties. And Amanita pantherina has the same toxins, same properties, but many times more the concentration of the compounds in it, and it's quite dangerous. We did have one death on Vancouver Island, a 17-year-old youth who ate a whole bunch of Amanita pantherinas and partied and drank a lot of alcohol and ate junk food, and then he died asphyxiating on his vomit after he'd become unconscious. And the coroner's report put as primary cause alcohol poisoning, secondary was Amanita pantherina poisoning, causing asphyxia. Then there's the classic true hallucinogenic psilocybin intoxication, which is associated with colorful visions, and being a fairly alert and conscious state throughout the experience, as opposed to these dreamy dream states or the twilight sleep deliriums. Oh, by the way, the Amanita muscaria pantherina intoxication sometimes result in convulsions and very delirious thrashing around and some pretty bizarre behavior. And anecdotally, I tracked down when I was at certain conferences years ago where there was a predominance of psychoactive enthusiasm. I used to get any chance where people would start talking about Amanita experiences, I'd start plugging them for information and figured out that caffeine and other stimulants is definitely contraindicated with these delirium type things because they're antagonistic to the delirium sort of sleepy time effects of them, and that's all the people I talked to that went through convulsive periods and thrashed around, had these really bizarre episodes. They always had some type of stimulant, whether it's tea, coffee, soda, drinks with caffeine, chocolate. So, something to be aware of. Psilocybin and psilocin, they're found in various wild mushrooms, and they became black market items.
In the grass.
Yeah. And the primary causes of problems here, it's psychological. And there used to be a lot of scare about drugs driving people mad, but there's a meta-study done of the psychiatric admissions before and after hallucinogens hit, in this case, North America. I think they included Europe in the meta-study too. What they found was that the admission rates per capita of the population were constant before and after for the clearly identifiable things like schizophrenia, various psychoses, and all these really clear psychiatric conditions. But the age of admission upon the time of the introduction of psychedelics grew younger. So a lot of it triggered the prevalence of hallucinogens, triggered latent pre-existing psychiatric conditions that probably would have emerged later on in life. So it's always one of the big issues with legalization of these is being cautious who has access to them, because it's something that, anyway, I will go on about that. So we have the different things too, paniolas, like the Subultiatus, that can contain psilocybin, psilocin. Really likes old horse manure, by the way, like old stable yards that are all leached out and degraded, straw and manure. Gymnopolis luteofolius is another psilocybin-containing mushroom. And then there's another group of hallucinogenic fungi, and I just throw them in here on the psychedelics theme because it's ergot that grows, a parasite on grasses, and it produces the source compounds that LSD was made from. So lysergic acids are found in these ergot, and that's He was responsible for epidemics of madness at one point, and it's believed that the Great Fear in France that led to, there was a couple days of what they call the Great Fear that led to the Revolution of France. It's thought that a rye harvest, heavily contaminated with ergot, was brought in, and because of the famine at the time, a lot of peasants ate it, and a lot of them rushed through Paris with farm implements and overthrew the Bastille, but also, oddly enough, ways away from Paris, peasants were running into the woods, into the forest, howling and screaming too. So it's thought that that was an ergot outbreak. Anyway, I do go on. And this is LSD, the synthetic compound that was derived from ergot. And then here we have a bunch of GI upsets and some miscellaneous things. Hebelomas. The common name, poison pie. A lot of hebelomas have pretty nasty compounds that cause a good GI workout. Fairly, not fatal, but quite often people sort of wish it was. And it may be the idea of being aware of where you pick mushrooms. A lot of the hebelomas are corpse mushrooms. They like to grow on where animal remains have rotted into the ground. So corpse finders. So here's a case where you could probably both get the toxins of hebeloma and some nasty bacteria from a deer carcass. You always pick mushrooms in pristine habitat. Lepiotis olivaceombrinus is an ugly, warty, toad-like thing that is poisonous, causes gastrointestinal discomfort. But it's also neat because if you spray a base like ammonia or KOH on it, it turns magenta. Sort of a neat thing. And various Lepiotis corbiculatus is supposed to cause gastrointestinal problems. Gelatinous-based ramarias are linked to gastrointestinal.
We have some here, I think.
Yeah. Oh, great.
Yeah, one piece anyway.
Okay, enough to fry up.
I didn't think you liked mushrooms, Paul.
I don't. Yeah, this is why. There's some things that are not the mushrooms themselves, but still toxins. And an example is this blackish mold that grows on coral fungi. It contains some really nasty, tumorigenic, nasty compounds. And it's a bit scary because at the initial stage of infection, it can be hard to pick up on this very faint grayishness. That eventually it becomes black and hairy, and it's pretty evident that the mushroom's contaminated. And Amanita franchetti was just recently claimed to have caused several deaths in Qingji province, China. And symptoms were gastrointestinal with fairly rapid onset, 2 to 15 hours, with nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, general aching, abdominal distension, pain, and dizziness. And then it would resolve itself, and then after a week or so, there was massive, I think it was heart failure, and they couldn't quite figure out why the heart went kablooey, but it was quite odd. It hasn't been fully explained in the paper. Claiming this had some real problems of translation and editing, so it's not quite sure what was going on there. They believed that they were eating Amanita rubescens, which is this good edible mushroom pictured here. And it was a mushroom of commerce in markets there, and now it's being banned. But what they had was apparently Amanita franchetti that caused these severe symptoms. Very distinctive, very pretty mushroom.
The story of mycologist, is it related to that?
No, that was Pancillus that took out a mycologist. Amanita smithiana is mistaken for pine mushroom, causes kidney failure. And in October 26, 2011, 63-year-old male ate a soup made from these wild mushrooms, and he believed them to be pine mushroom. He made a soup out of several types of mushrooms. Puffballs, meadow mushrooms, the prints, and what he thought were pine mushrooms. And Here's the recipe. Boiled them in water, onions, garlic, and cream were added. 4 hours after eating the soup, he became ill. 20 hours after, he developed kidney failure. Was hospitalized for 2 weeks, got dialysis. I can't remember how many sessions over 9 days. He had a few sessions of dialysis. And the soup was submitted to me for identification, so I was able to pick through the soup, and I picked out pieces of mushrooms and divided them up by characteristics, gross morphological characteristics, and did microscopy. Found several pieces of Amanita smithiana in there, and I was able to identify the spores were amyloid, turning bluish in iodine solution in a particular shape and size. And so I was able to pick out the pieces of Amanita from the various other bits in the soup. And these were submitted to a lab in Innsbruck, Austria. That's working on Amanita smithiana poisoning, and they did paper chromatography on using the soup liquid from the soup sample, the isolated fragments of the Amanita smithiana from the soup that had been picked out of the soup, and this was a voucher sample of Amanita smithiana. Then this was a negative control, which was Amanita phalloides death cap soup, which was made with Amanita phalloides, a non-poisonous mushroom, the Lepiotis or Xerocomus vadius, onion, celery, peppers, salt, egg, and cream. Yum. And then it was spotted on the paper and it ran. And this red blotch here and the orange is the Amanita smithiana toxin, and that's lacking from the deadly Amanita phalloides soup. And what this shows that is kind of scary is there's very high value of the toxin in the broth portion of the soup. So when you cook up a mushroom dish, if you change your mind, just picking the mushroom out of the dish may not cut it. You know, the toxin may have diffused through the rest of the dish. The victim of that poisoning survived, and he was very cooperative and helped out a lot with it.
Well, I said when people used to drink a lot in the old days, you never should mix your drinks. It seems like you never should mix your mushroom.
Yeah, it's really nice not to do a whole hodgepodge, because we get poisoning cases where we look at a sample of the food or stomach contents, and it's just like it's like a displayed foray table or something. So who do you blame? I mean, we don't know what combinations of things might do. Okay, Paxillus involutus and other Paxillus cause this autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And this is the one that killed a professional mycologist. There was a Schaefer, or no, not Schaefer. I think R.L. Schaefer. There's a couple of different, very close spellings of European. It was a Czech mycologist who, and he had apparently been interred in a Nazi prisoner of war camp or concentration camp, and upon the end of the war, liberation, he was liberated, and with chronic food shortages, he went out being a mycologist and gathered a huge whack of Paxillus involutus and ate them and died. And he apparently was in extremely bad shape, already dehydrated and starved from his period in imprisonment. So it was just the final straw. But that's the only professional mycologist, to my understanding, who died of mushroom poisoning. Otherwise, it's been hushed.
Obvious misidentification.
Yeah, that's right. And at the time, Paxillus was considered to be edible.
Oh.
Yeah, it wasn't known to be toxic. And that's a lot of these are just recent.
I haven't overlooked at this list.
Oh, yeah.
Government of Canada conversation.
Oh, yeah. The old BC handbook, unfortunately, referred to it as the brown chanterelle.
And in Europe, it's still eaten a lot. I know in Riga, the Museum of Natural History every year tries to teach people not to eat this mushroom, and it's just eaten, and actually eaten a lot in Russia and eaten a lot in Poland.
We have a lot of German people in Vancouver that pick it in great quantity and eat it. And we don't know why some people seem able to do it. We think that there might be more than one species that are being confused. It might be, we're not quite sure what's going on there.
Part of it, I think, what they thought it was over there is that the consistent eating of it is just, you can eat a little bit of it, but it's kind of like Gyromycin too. You just get that one level, and it does, and also age and how healthy your own liver is. So those combinations.
There is, by the way, the Czechs are a bit nuts as a people when it comes to mushrooms. Like many European people, they have funny attitudes. And there is a Czech mycologist who wrote a paper, and I think with Česká mycology, about poisoning by edible mushrooms. And he described how he'd been eating these mushrooms for years, and then he went out and gathered a bunch and cooked them up, ate them, and got sick. And it turned out that he had a loving and devoted wife who they'd been together ever since they were married, and this was decades and decades before. And he was always going out and making up big boxes of mushrooms, bringing them back, and she'd diligently throw out the poisonous ones and cook up the edible ones. And then for the first time in their marriage, she went off to visit family, and he went out, gathered a whole bunch of mushrooms, brought them home, cooked them up, and ate them. And then when his wife got back, and he told her that he'd written and submitted this little article for the Mycological Journal, she explained to him that, "Oh no, dear, I've been throwing those out all the time." Lepiotis hematinus is funny. The red tubed, darkly blue staining bolete are supposed to be poisonous. Daniel Winkler has been now systematically eating red-pored boletes because when he visits Germany, he finds a lot of his friends and family have always been eating these red-pored boletes and really like them. So he's been trying them, and apparently he's had great success gobbling down Boletus satanus without terrible effect. Boletus diabolicus.
Is that the same thing as this?
Yeah, this is one of our North American red tube boletes.
Oh.
I think he tried this one and said it was very tasty. And again, he said he didn't get any symptoms.
Are they
This,
just GI symptoms, or do they affect?
Yeah, GI symptoms, apparently very severe. There have been deaths attributed to the severe dehydration and intestinal bleeding and such, that are just from the vigorousness of the GI event. So that we don't know. Entaloma Liverdem, a lot of the Entalomas are infamous for being gastrointestinal poison. Certain trichomas, especially cardinum, is known to be. I think this is the one that causes explosive black stenchy diarrhea that apparently is very unpleasant. Memorable apparently because it's rather vividly described by those that deal with it. Scleroderma citrinum. The sclerodermas are highly suspect of all being toxic, causing gastrointestinal upset.
Is that a puffball?
That's an earth ball.
Oh.
They're really tough, and they have purple, dark-colored gleba even when they're young. So that's one reason we cut puffballs in half to make sure that they're white inside, because there are these dark, centered false puffballs or earth balls. And there's rather disturbing reports that in products from China that were labeled black truffles were actually these things canned with truffle oil. Poisonous agaricus smell like creosote or sort chemically and stain instantly dark yellow at the base, and there's several of them. genus Agaricus is rather difficult to identify. And then these are the edible mushroom poisonings. And these are just a few of the mushrooms that have been considered edible. This is the angel wings or Pleurocephalic origins that the elderly Japanese kidney patients who were on dialysis suffered encephalopathy from brain, what we used to call brain fever.
How do you figure that out, though? If people have been eating them safely for years and years and years, and then there's this one report.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
It was apparently a tremendous year for these growing in Japan. And we have lots of reports from Japan of weird mushroom poisonings. I think because of the population of Japan and the fondness for mushrooms, if they have a big bumper year for something, people will go out and they won't just eat a few. I think there's sort of this real take advantage of the situation mentality. And that probably, this affected all the patients were receiving dialysis in treatment for kidney disease. And obviously this wouldn't, if it's linked to the dialysis, then it wouldn't have shown up before dialysis became a routine sort of thing.
Can it be confused with oysters?
Yeah, these grow on conifer wood rather than broadleaf wood, and they're very delicate and thin, and they're quite nice. They're supposed to be quite tasty for those that like to eat mushrooms. Then there was something that's very similar to angel wings that turned out very scary is this Trogia Venenata. Turns out to be an undescribed species and caused lots of deaths, attributed to 400 deaths in Yunnan province, China. It was some kind of regional delicacy. And the sudden unexplained deaths, and it's really murky. The story behind this is very murky, like many of these reports coming from China. The information is not necessarily very well. It may be problems of translation. It may be a whole different reporting thing there. I don't know. It's very hard to rely on the data. It's not data as we know it to present. I like that SUD syndrome, S-U-D, sudden unexplained death. Okay, that covers a lot of ground. Talk about covering your butt. Letiporus conifericula, or Letiporus sulphureus, a chicken of the woods, causes gastrointestinal upset fairly regularly if people eat them undercooked. If they eat them when they're over mature, if they eat too much of them, if they eat them growing from certain trees like redwood or eucalyptus or cedar or yew or certain other trees. And we had a case in Vancouver of a 6-year-old girl who ate a piece raw about the size of a loonie or so. And she had several hours of vivid hallucinations of monsters in yellow, orange, or red chasing her around. And she was reported as climbing up her mother's leg and behaving very strangely. And she was monitored, and she showed EEG, looked like she was having a bit of a wild, dreamy flurry of some sort. And she had all these hallucinations, and then she recovered spontaneously. I think they just gave her a bit of a tranquilizer, put her in a quiet space, and she mellowed down eventually. And then investigation showed that the family were very not, they appeared not to have any recreational drugs around the home or in the yard. They didn't have pharmaceuticals in the house. They didn't have toxic cleaning products. They're generally sort of health conscious, very clean living people. So the only explanation was that the girl had been seen eating the mushroom by a sibling. And then I was given the fruiting body with this chunk missing out of it to identify. And so it appears that for some reason this raw sulfur mushroom produced hallucinosis in a young child. And that's, and Tricholoma equestrae, there are cases in France where there are these popular crops, and lots of people were eating them several times a day for several days, and they develop rhabdomyolysis, which begins as wasting of the muscle tissue, and then you get a lot of breakdown products from the proteins and such from the.
Is that man on horseback?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, equestrae or flavobirons. And then this swamps out the kidneys, and usually the cause of death or morbidity is the kidney failure caused by it being swamped out overwhelmed by all these toxic byproducts of muscle breakdown.
Or why do they call it man on horseback?
Equestrae means man on. I think because it grows in pastures and fields in England, or somebody was feeling whimsical.
The French call it the chevalier, and it might have come from France.
Yeah.
Maurice.
Come from where? You said it's called Chevalier. Why?
I'm not sure why.
Oh, but did Maurice eat them?
Rusula subnigricans causes very similar syndromes. This is something that people in Japan and Taiwan were eating, and there's several cases of rhabdomyolysis resulting in kidney failure there too. And so we're looking at pictures emerging of not being very safe to experiment. Then just recently, it's been realized cruising over North American and European poisoning reports that lexinum is frequently implicated in gastrointestinal problems. And it's being reported all over North America. And myself, I used to eat a lot of lexinums. I began to get gastrointestinal upset and queasiness, and I turned white as a ghost and started sweating, chilly, and it just looked like death warmed over. And then after a few hours, it would pass. Sometimes I could get nauseated and vomit. And I avoided all boletes cooked from the fresh state. It never happened when I ate dried boletes that had been reconstituted, just the freshly cooked ones. And so it looks like lexinums may not be a group that you can blanket say they're all edible, and we'll have to do a lot more work to figure out which ones are causing problems, because usually it's just Aurantiaca or Scaber, one of these people are just assuming they're very familiar one, but there may be certain lexinums out there that are problematic. And then shiitake causes what's called flagellate erythema. And this is when people eat a lot of them raw or undercooked, lightly cooked, from the fresh state, freshly, still fresh ones cooked up lightly. And this, especially, they realized suddenly that this was a real issue when they were doing a study with a whole bunch of medical, individuals were being studied where they all had some kind of medical condition, and they were being fed fresh shiitake to monitor their particular, I can't remember which condition was being studied, but a certain number of them got this very dramatic looking red rash with little streaks on the back. And it's not caused by scratching or anything, it's just this rash appears in streaks. And it is linked now to these fresh shiitake. And by the way, I looked up flagellate erythema to see what other things could cause it. And I seem to recall one of the things that occurs in a deep, severe dehydration. Sometimes people get these weird streaky rashes. I think of as well, heat stroke and so something kind of weird. I try not to. So this is something, medical mushrooms are really a hot item now, and people sometimes get carried away and a bit goofy with the medical mushrooms, and they expect miracles from them. There's a rather startling incident in Japan, some incidents where patients, cancer patients who are undergoing chemotherapy, had heard about Agaricus blazei supposedly being the magic wonder bullet for certain cancers. So without telling their regular physicians, they're consuming huge dosages of these Agaricus blazei and experienced liver failure. And were hospitalized, and then it came out that they were taking these Agaricus blazei. It turned out that there were several incidents of this. And there was even one woman who had undergone, she was doing the chemotherapy, then she started dosing on all these Agaricus blazei, and then she had the liver failure. She was put in the hospital, and they managed to, they had to break off the chemotherapy, and they managed to nurse her back into health, and the liver function resumed, and then she was able to undergo a round of chemo again, and then she apparently went through a period of remission, and then she had another manifestation, and so she underwent a second round of chemotherapy. She started superdosing on the Agaricus again. She had liver failure, hospitalized, and died from the liver failure, and combined with the...
Selling it commercially in bottles?
Yeah. And so when you hear these claims for the various mushrooms and things, remember that they're not magic bullets. And I like to urge people when they're like Robert and I and some others did a panel discussion, Telluride, and we all agreed that people most ideally would be incorporating these into their diet and their lifestyle and making them a part instead of like, wholeheartedly leaping in and worshiping at the reishi capsule booth you use. But that isn't what we all agreed on, but anyway, it's something like that. Yeah. And morels. I mentioned that morels are poisonous raw, and there's this great incident of the police chief of Vancouver retiring. And there's the banquet held, all sorts of dignitaries were there, the politicians and all the city hobnobs and the wealthy and the influential.
What a good group together.
Select target, real target. And so the chef prepared they all had lots of drinks, and then there is a salad, sort of an Asian-style salad with raw morel shiitakes, teriyaki, soya sauce, ginger, garlic. I have a recipe somewhere. Green onions, peanut oil. And so the chef had bought fresh morels, hundreds of pounds of fresh morels from an itinerant mushroom picker dealer who showed up at the back door of the restaurant. And he bought these, I think it was 200 pounds. And he put most of them out on trays, big, those big commercial kitchen cookie trays, and had them spread out in the walk-in freezer. And he was freezing them, and then he was going to bag them up and put them into storage for later use. And then he prepared the nice fresh ones for the banquet. And they had their salad, and they were waiting for the next dish and having the round of drinks before the next dish. And the first person to get sick was the health officer, the provincial health officer, John Blatherwick. And he did the great race to the porcelain relief valve. And then all sorts of other people started dropping like flies. There was, in all, 16% of the people at the banquet, there were 384 or something like that people guests at the banquet. 16% of them, I think it was 66 of them, experienced symptoms. One person was hospitalized, and that was a man who ate 2 portions because his wife refused to eat mushrooms. You can imagine that there were a lot of conversations after that. And I asked John Blatherwick when I had a conversation with him, I just asked him offhand, I said, do you still eat mushrooms? And he sort of coughed and said, no, I think it'll be a long time. And we were talking about, we got together and we were talking about developing a program. This might be something that other clubs would be involved in too, some kind of basic information pamphlet for chefs, restaurant workers, people in the commercial food trade, with the very basic things about how to select fresh quality mushrooms, what to look for to indicate spoilage, how to handle, store them, how to cook them and prepare them safely, etc.
How do you think that wild mushrooms should be regulated for sales in the markets? And
I like a lot of European models which have a list of commercially approved species. And they have several countries rate them. So they have an A class, a B class, a C class, for example. And I think it could be very tricky to put into practice, but it'd be very good if, for example, all people selling morels would have to have on the label cooked before eating, like you do with pork products. And then I don't know, it's really hard to deal with issues like contamination.
But there should be courses of training for people who are picking and selling commercial.
Yeah.
Just like Europe.
Yeah, and we should also have a mechanism here. Most European countries, all pharmacists are trained to identify mushrooms and plants. And so you can go in many countries to the local pharmacist with a basket of mushrooms, and they're trained to identify the ones that are known good edibles.
Is that right?
Yeah, Switzerland, Czech Republic, a lot of European countries have systems.
You should talk to the pharmaceutical society and get them to smarten up.
Yeah, and also in most European countries, they identify plants because of the prevalence of herbal medicine. So most pharmacists are able to identify the very common herbs used for making teas and the edible weeds and that sort of thing. And it was always, in Europe, it's still just considered natural that pharmacists would learn about the origins of drugs, the plant origins of them, so they'd have to know botany. Our pharmacists now have no training in botany as far as I know. What a backward culture. So anyway, that's the end. Eat me, said the mushroom. That's always the lure. These little elves are out there just waiting to entrap you. They're gremlin-like. They're very mischievous. And
Have you heard of any polypores being poisonous?
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's the chicken of the woods, which causes the gastrointestinal and the hallucinations in the young child. There's the conchs, of course, cause brain damage when they fall on you from a hence the name, which is onomatopoeia. Now there's
Polyporic acid.
polyporic acid in the officinalis, no.
This didn't have a
It's
lot
one,
of...
it's one polyporic.
yeah, it's one
Midulus.
Haplopilus.
Midulus.
Okay, yeah. It's a weird thing that turns magenta with KOH.
Yeah, it's also a diamond.
Oh, that's black diamond fungus?
No,
No.
it's a soft polyporous photographic. I'm thinking about it. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Want to think about for the club is I was at a Breitenbush foray one time and Gary Linkoff set up a whole row of frying pans and we had a poisonous mushroom tasting session. Everybody got a little bucket to spit into and we ate all sorts of different poisonous mushrooms and a lot of them are very tasty and very nice.
Excellent. So before we wind up and go and do some identification tonight, Melanie, do you have any kudos to give out?
Yes, I do. I have John Samuel. Where's John? Here, John.
John.
No, you're not in trouble. Beautiful card, printed out perfectly. Could read every single field. Nice notes. Congratulations, John.
So now you can collect some.
This should encourage the rest of you, because even after our talk this morning, we're still getting cards in that are unreadable, or fields missing, or things like that. So just be encouraged and see how happy John is looking.
Excellent. And so, my colleagues, anything really interesting? I know Roland's really happy with one find.
What is it?
Do you want to tell us quickly about that? And do we know who it was?
I have to look it up. I see the. I'm not sure. Wow.
What was the name of it?
Here it is.
So what did Bill find?
I don't know yet. And it's really exciting.
Excellent.
Can you
So,
repeat that? I didn't hear. What was that? The endocyclone? Endocyclone? Yeah. It's still there. Oh, the gill mushroom or what?
It's a
no gills at all. No gills? Almost.
so anyway, so once we get what that is, we'll get some of that out so everybody can see what it is. And actually, Rose is going to get you a prize. So you'll get that. Anybody for anything else? Tom, did you see anything that's worthwhile to recognize, Patrick?
Well, we had, somebody brought down Thursday, or whatever the first day was, Friday,
Yeah.
that Lepiotis melanopus that finally identified, that I had never seen before. And then somebody brought another one in today from here, so.
Oh, excellent.
We got two of those.
Repeat the name, please.
Lepiotis melanopus, it's a blackfoot,
Oh, yeah.
but it's not a common one. At least I've never seen it before.
Excellent. And look at that. Most of us leave our black-footed polypores in the woods. What we'll do is we'll find out we'll look up who those pickers are, and we'll get them a little something.
There's an albatrellis that has an exhibit too.
Oh, excellent.
Subrubescens, which probably hasn't been recorded for Alberta before.
Nope.
It's an ovine sort of thing, but with a red scaly cap.
Oh, excellent. Right, do you know who that was? You guys know who you were?
Oh, I can't remember. It's on that little label.
Excellent. We'll get that. And actually, tomorrow we're going to actually pick out the stuff beforehand, and so we can actually give you kudos. But anyway, so really good finding stuff. And anybody have anything else that they need to? Melanie, nothing?
Well,
News? Any
I've got
questions?
a question. For some of these, are they going to be on a website where we can look these up?
No, you got to come to these forums. Otherwise, any of the vulgar.
They find it in the database eventually.
Yeah, they get it.
Yeah.
No, but I meant this topic falls.
We're developing some stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Martin, you've got all new areas to go to tomorrow?
Yep.
Good.
Excellent. Actually, if somebody have their schedule? There's one on the table. Pass it to me. Oh, thanks. Yeah, so tomorrow, O'Hagan Road, there's a couple of beautiful sites on O'Hagan Road, and the West Castle Old Growth. It's going to be there's some beautiful old stuff along the road. There's going to be some campers in there, but there's some beautiful big trees. And so we've got some nice stuff happening.
So old growth being like cars, basically.
Yeah, that's actually cars, and the O'Hagan is both by bus. And the O'Hagan is just some beautiful sites there, and I'm really excited about going to those ones. Excellent. Other than that, enjoy, identify some mushrooms, and have some fun. Excellent. Good.
We get away earlier tomorrow.
Yeah, we're going to get away a little bit